Basic Ideas in the Benoni by John Nunn, international master and one of Britain's strongest young players.
The fundamental starting position for this cassette arises after the moves 1 pawn to queen 4 by white, knight to king's bishop 3 by black, 2 pawn to queen's bishop 4 for white, pawn to queen's bishop 4 for black, 3 pawn to queen's 5 by white, pawn to king's 3 by black, 4 knight to queen's bishop 3 by white, pawn takes pawn by black, 5 pawn takes pawn by white, pawn to queen's 3 by black. This is the position I call the fundamental Benoni position. You'll find it on the front cover of the pamphlet accompanying this cassette. Let's have a look at this position before analysing any particular variations. We'll have a look to see what the characteristic plans for both sides are here. The first thing we notice is the asymmetry in the pawn structure. Black has a queenside majority, a 3-2 majority, whereas white has a majority on the king side and more particularly in the centre, 2-1 here. This majority dominates the placing of the pieces for each side. Black must try to advance his queenside pawns with the ultimate objective of creating a passed pawn. White similarly will attempt to force through the advance pawn to king's 4 to king's 5, creating a passed queen's pawn for himself. How are both sides going to put their pieces so as to support these respective plans? The black pawns on queen's 3 and queen's bishop 4 control the important central squares king's 4 and queen's 5. This control of the long diagonal suggests that black should put his king's bishop on king's knight 2, so that black's next two moves in this position will almost inevitably be pawn to king's knight 3 and bishop to knight 2. There, on king's knight 2, that bishop will be in an excellent position to support his own queenside pawns and also to restrain the advance of the white centre pawns. White must react in the centre, but often he will do this rather slowly. If he plays directly with pawn to king's 4 and pawn to king's bishop's 4, he runs into the danger that he may weaken himself and allow black some tactical possibilities on the dark squares and perhaps on the diagonal from black's queen's rook 2 to king's knight 8, leading to white's king. Instead, white often plays for restraint first, aiming fundamentally to stop the black queenside advance before proceeding with his own central plan. To this end, black, when he plays pawn to queen's rook 3, will often find that white answers with pawn to queen's rook 4. Then white has considerable control over the black queen's knight 4 square, and therefore he can prevent pawn to queen's knight 4 by black. We shall see when we analyse particular variations how black overcomes the problem of the temporary blockade of his queenside pawns. The various white plans in this opening fall into two distinct categories. There are the aggressive systems, where white advances both the king's pawn and the king's bishop's pawn, and a third aggressive system is white playing knight to king's bishop 3 to queen 2 to queen's bishop 4, with an attack on the black queen's pawn. Remember that if black is going to develop his bishop on king's knight 2, this queen's pawn is going to be rather weak, and if white can execute this knight manoeuvre and combine it with bishop to king bishop 4, then black will often be in considerable difficulties over the defence of this weak queen's pawn. The other main plan for white involves a much slower development. He first of all develops his pieces in quite classical style. He just plays pawn to king's 4, knight to king's bishop 3, bishop to king 2, and castles. Thereafter he will attempt to restrain the black queenside play, and only when he has completely consolidated his own position, and reduced black's plans to nothing, then he will advance with his central pawn push, pawn to king's bishop 4 and pawn to king's 5. Normally he will retreat his knight on king bishop 3 back to queen 2, getting it out of the way of the king's bishop's pawn, defending the king's pawn, and preparing the aforementioned knight to queen bishop 4 manoeuvre. Black also has a certain variety of plans, although the plan of advancing queenside pawns is frequently the most important. Black would like to play this pawn to queen's knight 4 move, but as we shall see, he very rarely manages it. Instead, he often has to content himself with playing queen to queen bishop 2 and pawn to queen's bishop 5. This is also a good thing for black to play if he can manage it. Remember that if the white knight goes back to queen 2, there will often be too many pieces on that queen's bishop 4 square. Only if black is completely blocked on the queen side will he attempt to operate on other sectors of the board. Well, why should one play the Benoni? First of all, this defence of the queen's pawn has, as we can see, already led to an unbalanced pawn structure. This means that the games will be very hard fought. Often a single tempo will decide whose majority gets home first, so that tactical chances and tactical possibilities will play a very important role in the middle game. One always has to be aware of the chances for black in exploiting weaknesses in white's position. On the other hand, it must be admitted that the theoretical position of the Benoni is really not quite so good as many other defences to the queen's pawn. Grandmasters sometimes think that the opening depends more on traps than on positional soundness and good strategic planning. However, ex-world champion Tal plays this opening and has played it many times in the past with great successes, and as we shall see when we look at some particular games, other grandmasters are also willing to try this at various times, even in quite important games. This cassette is not intended to be a thorough theoretical exposition. We won't be attempting to give a complete analysis of the Benoni. It is more a sequence of excerpts, all of which are, I hope, instructive, and all of which show typical lines of play for both sides. The first side of this cassette will mention all the lines apart from the classical variation, namely the aggressive lines for white, and the classical variation will be dealt with on the second side. It is in practice by far the most popular and also the most theoretically important of white's possibilities. Now let's get on to look at some specific variations. The first possibility for white is the Maecenas gambit. This goes 6 pawn to king's 4 by white, pawn to king's knight 3 by black, 7 pawn to king's bishop 4 for white, bishop to knight 2 by black, 8 pawn to king 5 for white. This is the characteristic move of the Maecenas gambit. White is going to give up a pawn in order to stop black from castling. The main line for black is to play here 8 king's knight to queen's 2. Now black is simply threatening to castle, after which the white centre will collapse and black will have the better game. So white must continue aggressively, and he does this by playing either 9 knight to king 4 or 9 knight to knight 5. Both these lines lead to the same thing. So let's suppose white plays 9 knight to king's 4. Black replies 9 pawn takes pawn, 10 knight to queen 6 check for white, king to king 2 for black, 11 knight takes bishop check for white, queen takes knight for black. This is position 1 in the pamphlet. Black is a pawn up in this position, and even has a certain lead in development. All white's remaining pieces lie on their original squares. On the other hand, the black king is very considerably exposed. White also has a potential long-term advantage in his two bishops. And last of all, black often finds it rather hard to put his rook on the king's file in this position, and frequently gets his pieces in rather a tangle. Well, switch off now and think about white's position and decide which move you would play for white to continue the attack here. We will look at two moves for white, which I shall call the old and the new lines. The old line runs 12 pawn to queen 6 check for white. The idea of this is to drive the black king back onto the first rank, and therefore prevent black from deploying his rook on the king's file. Black replies 12 king to bishop 1, and white plays 13 knight to bishop 3. Now black has a rather surprising continuation, by which he gives up the pawn for attacking chances against the white king. Black plays 13 pawn to king's 5. White plays 14 knight to knight 5. And now black plays pawn to king's rook 3, giving away the king's pawn. White takes it, 15 knight takes king's pawn, and black plays 15 queen to king's 1. The pin on the white knight in this position is very awkward to meet, since black has the possibility pawn to king's bishop's 4, winning a piece, if white simply plays, say, bishop to queen's 3 in this position. So white's defence must also unpin the knight. He has to play 16 queen to king 2 here. Black plays 16 knight to queen's bishop 3. This carries the awkward threat of knight to queen's 5. It may seem surprising, you can check it for yourself if you wish, but the only defence against this threat is to play 17 king to bishop 2. Black plays 17 bishop to queen 5 check, and white has to play 18 king to knight 3. We see how the tables have been turned in this position. It is now the white king which is more exposed than the black king. Black's king has a perfectly safe square on king's knight 2. That is the common square for the black king in the Maecenas gambit. It often finds sanctuary there. And black has far more attacking chances with his active knights than white has. So that's one variation which is very favourable for black. And for this reason, the new variation of the Maecenas gambit was devised in order to improve white's chances. So go back now to position 1 and we'll see what happens in the new variation. White plays 12 knight to bishop 3. The plan here is to leave the white queen's pawn on queen's 5 in order to prevent black from developing his queen's knight onto its best square, queen's bishop 3. I would like to suggest a new line at this point for black, which has so far not been tried, but seems to me to offer very good chances indeed. Black plays 12 pawn to king's 5. White replies 13 knight to knight 5, and black plays knight to knight 3. The point of this variation is that white finds it extremely difficult to develop threats along his queen's knight 3 to king's bishop 7 diagonal. For example, if white now plays 14 queen to knight 3, black can reply king to bishop 1. And now any attempt by white to threaten mate on king bishop 2 can be met by pawn to bishop 5 by black, blocking the diagonal and removing any danger to the black king. If you look for yourself at this variation, you will find that white's attack cannot proceed. If white captures the king's pawn with his knight, black has the possibility of playing bishop to queen's 5. That stops white from castling on the king's side, and after the black king goes to king's knight 2, there will be various dangerous possibilities by just playing the black rook onto the king's file, and white frequently gets caught up in a very annoying and dangerous pin, whereas the black pieces can develop now quite freely and actively. Well, that should give you a good idea of how to play against the Maecenas gambit. So next we will look at the variation called Taimanov's line. So go back now to the fundamental Benoni position. From this position, white plays 6 pawn to king's 4, black pawn to king's knight 3, white 7 pawn to bishop's 4, black bishop to knight 2, white 8 bishop to knight 5 check. There is a tactical point here that black is unable to interpose his queen's knight, which is after all the natural move, because white would then be able to play very strongly pawn to king's 5. So in this position, the best way to answer the check is to play 8 king's knight to queen 2. Now black has the threat of playing pawn to queen's rook 3, driving away the bishop, followed by pawn to queen's knight 4, and he's achieved the most important advance in the Benoni. So white's normal way of answering this is to play 9 bishop to queen's 3. Black plays 9 castles. White continues 10 knight to bishop 3. Now let's see why black adopts the plan normally recommended by theory. If black played pawn to queen's rook 3 in this position, white would just answer pawn to queen's rook 4, and black will be unable to maneuver his pieces around to cover his own queen's knight 4 square in order to effect the advance pawn to queen's knight 4. So black in this position plays knight to rook 3 first, with the idea of playing knight to bishop 2, pawn to queen's rook 3, and rook to queen's knight 1 if necessary, finally putting enough pieces on the queen's knight 4 square so as to force through pawn to queen's knight 4 against anything white can do. So after 10 knight to rook 3, white plays 11 castles. Again at this point I would like to suggest a move which is rather unusual, but seems to offer better chances than the normal line. This is 11 rook to knight 1 by black. This puts white in rather a dilemma, because he has to find a good constructive move at this point, and the natural moves have defects. For example, if white plays pawn to queen's rook 4, black will answer knight to knight 5. The white bishop will be severely embarrassed on queen's 3, black would be delighted to exchange it off, and if white retreats with bishop to knight 1, then black plays pawn to queen's knight 3. His queen's bishop now comes into active play on queen's rook 3, and black already is seizing the initiative. So let's put a few pieces back. White bishop on queen's 3, the black knight on knight 5 back to rook 3, the black queen's knight's pawn back to knight 2, and the white queen's rook's pawn back to rook 2. It is probable that the best move at this point for white is bishop to king's 3, with a roughly equal game. But instead of that move, if white plays the natural move 12, knight to queens 2, then he's fallen right into a trap. Black replies with the surprising pawn to queens knight 4. If you look for yourself at this position, you will find that both methods for white of capturing this queen's knight's pawn lead to loss of material. Whereas if he doesn't take the pawn, then black simply pushes on with pawn to bishop's 5 and pawn to knight's 5, and white has been driven right back practically onto his original squares. So that's a rather nice trap, and even the best move for white leads only to equality. So rook to knight 1 seems to be a good move for black in this variation. Well, let's go on to another line for white, the so-called knight's tour variation. So back to the fundamental Benoni position again. White plays 6 knight to bishop 3, pawn to king's knight 3 by black, 7 knight to queen 2 by white, bishop to knight 2 by black, 8 knight to bishop 4 by white, castles by black, 9 bishop to bishop 4 by white. This is the point of the knight's tour variation. White attacks in the swiftest possible way the weak black pawn on queen's 3. I'm going to follow a game, Donner v Planinch, from Vaikarnzee 1973. Before this game, black's normal move was the rather passive knight to king's 1, but Planinch showed a remarkable new idea by which black simply gives up the queen's pawn for very active piece play. Planinch's surprising move was 9 pawn to knight 3 in this position. A typical move in the knight's tour, black aims to play bishop to queen's rook 3 followed by bishop takes knight, exchanging off the knight which white has spent so many tempi manoeuvring to queen's bishop's 4. Well, have a look at this position for yourself and see if you can decide what will happen if white captures the pawn. If white played knight takes queen's pawn in this position, black would reply knight to rook 4, and this move wins a piece. Another possibility for white would be to decline the sacrifice altogether and play 10 pawn to king 3, but that wouldn't be very good. Black would simply play bishop to rook 3, take the white knight off, and then he would have gained time by omitting the useless knight to king's 1. Donner realised this and took up the challenge by playing 10 bishop takes pawn. Black played rook to king's 1. This move has the threat of bishop to rook 3, when both the knight on queen bishop 4 and the white bishop on queen 6 would be endangered. So Donner withdrew the exposed bishop by playing 11 bishop to knight 3. Planinch continued actively with 11 knight to king's 5, with a threat on queen's bishop 3. Donner played knight takes knight. Planinch recaptured 11 rook takes knight, threatening not only the knight on queen bishop 4, but also the move rook to queen 5. White continued with the natural move 13 pawn to king's 3. Switch off now and see if you can discover what black's next move was. This was 13 pawn to queen's knight 4. Donner naturally replied 14 knight to queen 6, attacking the black rook and the black queen's knight's pawn. Planinch continued with 14 rook to queen's knight 5, and white played 15 bishop takes pawn. The idea here is that if black should capture the white queen's knight's pawn with his bishop, white would simply castle, leaving the exchange on queen's rook 1 to be taken. then black's lack of development and weakened black squares would prove a fatal weakness. Planinch instead continued with the most surprising move, 15 bishop to bishop 1, with the crude threat of winning a piece. Donner removed the exposed bishop from queen's knight 5 by playing 16 bishop to bishop 6. Now again switch off here and see if you can discover how black answered the threat to his rook. He played 16 bishop to queen's rook 3 here. A surprising rook sacrifice in order to stop white from castling on the king's side. Donner at this point made a mistake. He should have tried queen to queen 2, and he still has some defensive chances. Instead, he played 17 bishop takes rook. Black replied rook takes pawn, threatening mate in 2 moves. White stopped this with 18 queen to rook 4, but black replied with 18 queen to bishop 3. Black has 2 terrible threats of queen to bishop 6 check and rook to king 7 check, uncovering an attack on the white rook at queen's rook 1. White just about managed to stop both these threats with 19 rook to queen bishop 1. Black replied simply with 19 bishop takes knight. Notice that white is unable to exchange this bishop because of the mating threat on white's king's bishop 2. So the material deficit has been reduced to only an exchange. The white king is trapped in the centre, and the white bishop on queen's rook 8 is playing no part at all in the game. One must consider this position quite one for black. In fact, Donner didn't last very long. He played 20 pawn to bishop 4. Planinch played queen to bishop 4, threatening to come in with the queen and mate white on white's king's 2. 21 pawn to king 4 for white occurred here. Rook to king 7 check by black. 22 king to queen 1 for white. Queen to king's rook 4 by black. The mating threats from this discovery couldn't be met, so at this point Donner resigned. A very imaginative idea from Planinch. It seems that however white plays after he takes the pawn, black gets a most dangerous initiative. I'd like now to move on to another line, the so-called Penrose-Towel line. So back to the fundamental Benoni position. The line gained this name after British champion Jonathan Penrose defeated world champion Towel in 1960. White plays 6 pawn to king 4, pawn to king's knight 3 by black, 7 bishop to queen 3 by white, bishop to knight 2 by black, 8 king's knight to king 2 by white, castles by black, 9 castles by white. White's plan is to advance his king's bishop's pawn at some point. Normally he will have to prepare this by playing pawn to king's rook 3 in order to prevent black from answering the pawn to king bishop 4 move by knight to knight 5. And then white will attempt to use this advanced pawn centre to launch a dangerous attack on black's king. On the first few occasions this line appeared, white's plan was successful, but since then better methods have been devised for black. Black plays 9 pawn to queen's rook 3. White 10 pawn to queen's rook 4. Queen to bishop 2 by black. 11 pawn to king's rook 3 by white. Queen's knight to queen 2 by black. 12 pawn to bishop 4 for white. In the Penrose towel game, black played rook to king's 1 at this point. However, it has since been discovered that this move is a waste of a tempo, and that black should proceed immediately on the queen side with 12 rook to knight 1. This way, black immediately threatens the queenside advance, with first of all pawn to bishop 5, driving away the white bishop, and then pawn to queen's knight 4, and the black pawns really rush forwards. White plays 13 bishop to king's 3 here, and now I'm going to follow a game Timon v Lebojevic from Amsterdam 1975. Black's best continuation here, which Lebojevic didn't play, is 13 pawn to bishop 5, followed by pawn to queen's knights 4 next move. Lebojevic instead played 13 rook to king's 1. This isn't such a good move because there's a danger of transposing back into the Penrose towel variation. White played 14 knight to knight 3. Black pawn to bishop 5. White 15 bishop to queen's bishop 2. Knight to bishop 4 by black. This is diagram 2 in the pamphlet. White should at this point play 16 queen to bishop 3. Then, if 16 pawn to queen's knight 4, and what other good move does black have? White plays 17 pawn takes pawn. Black pawn takes pawn. White 18 pawn to king's 5. Pawn takes pawn by black. White 19 pawn to bishop 5. This is the position which arose in the Penrose towel game, and white went on to win with a direct attack down the king's bishop file. The rest of this game can be found in the supplementary booklet. Well, now we'll go back to diagram 2 and see how the Timon Lebojevic game continued. Timon played 16 bishop to queen 4, preparing the thrust pawn to king 5. Black ignored it and went straight ahead with 16 pawn to queen's knight 4. White played 17 pawn takes pawn. Black recaptured pawn takes pawn. Black is now threatening to win the white king's pawn by means of pawn to knight 5. So Timon has nothing better than to continue with his plan, 18 pawn to king's 5. Black went on pawn takes pawn, and white played 19 pawn takes pawn. Switch off here and decide what you would play for black in this position. Lebojevic continued with 19 rook takes pawn. White did not accept this exchange sacrifice. Had he done so, 20 bishop takes rook. Black recaptures queen takes bishop. And now black is threatening the white knight on king's knight 3. Moreover, he threatens to play pawn to knight 5, winning the white queen's knight's pawn, and last of all, he simply threatens development with bishop to queen's knight 2, picking off the white queen's pawn. To seize the black squares in the Benoni is an important objective for black, and he quite frequently offers the exchange to get rid of white's own black squared bishop. This almost always enhances the power of that bishop lurking on the long diagonal until it can become a decisive influence. So let's put the white bishop back on queen's 4, the black queen on queen's bishop 2, and the black rook on king's 4. Timon decided to meet the exchange sacrifice with 20 queen to bishop 3, reasoning that the black rook on king's 4 will be pinned against his knight on king's bishop 3. However, Lebovic continued his attack with 20 rook to knight 4, counter-attacking the white knight on king's knight 3. Timon's reply was to move this knight on king's knight 3 to king 4, and black played 21 knight on queen's bishop's 4 takes knight. White recaptured 22 bishop takes knight on king's 4. Switch off here and have a look to see if you can find how Lebovic won the game very quickly. He played 22 knight to knight 5, not only threatening mate in 1, but also discovering an attack on the loose white bishop on white's queen's 4. If white takes the knight, 23 pawn takes knight, black plays bishop takes bishop check, white plays king to rook 1, and black captures the white king's knight's pawn with his bishop, winning the white queen because of the threat of rook to rook 4 mate. Replace now the black bishop on king's knight 2, the other black bishop on queen's bishop 1, the white king on king's knight 1, white pawn on king's rook 3, black knight on king's knight 5, and white bishop on queen's 4. Black's threats are decisive at this stage, and after a few further moves, 23 pawn to queen 6, bishop takes bishop check by black, 24 king to rook 1 by white, queen takes pawn by black, queen takes pawn check by white, king to rook 1 by black, white resigned. A very impressive display of the control of the black squares by black in the Benoni. So, in this line, it is better for black to omit the move rook to king's white 1 and press straight ahead on the queen side with his advance pawn to bishop 5 and pawn to queen's knight 4. Generally, in this variation, if black can get in his pawn advance, pawn to knight 5, attacking the white knight on queen bishop 3, before white has prepared an escape square for it on king's 4, then he's doing very well indeed. However, you should be careful that white doesn't manage to force through pawn to king's 5 at some point, unless of course you have a nice manoeuvre such as the one employed by Lebovic in this game. This is the end of side 1. Turn over now for the rest of the cassette. This side is concerned entirely with the classical variation. From the fundamental Benoni position, this runs 6 pawn to king's 4 for white, pawn to king's knight 3 for black, 7 knight to bishop 3 by white, bishop to knight 2 for black, 8 bishop to king 2 for white, castles for black, 9 castles for white. This is position 3 in the pamphlet. What are the plans for both sides in this position? Black still has his old idea of advancing the queenside pawns, but this is rather difficult to execute in this position. White hasn't weakened himself at all by advancing his king's bishop's pawn, and he has every chance of keeping his own queen's knight 5 square firmly under control. Black might try the plan of knight to rook 3 in this position, which we saw in another variation, and this indeed is the old line for black. At one time it was quite popular, but a number of games, notably by Gligorich, demonstrated that white could restrain black's play on the queen side and consolidate his own centre, leaving black in a very passive position indeed. I'd like to give a game now where white's strategy succeeds. This is the game I had as black against Timon, played in London in 1975. This ran 9 pawn to queen's rook 3 for black, 10 pawn to queen's rook 4 for white, bishop to knight 5 by black. The idea of this move is to exchange on king's bishop's 3, and after white recaptures with his bishop, white's control over his own queen's bishop's 4 and queen's knight 5 squares will have been weakened, and black will have much better chances of advancing his pawns on the queen side. For example, if black plays pawn to bishop 5, he might then infiltrate with his knights by playing queen's knight to queen 2 to bishop 4 and ultimately penetrating on the weak squares at queen's knight 6 and queen 6. Timon played 11 bishop to king's knight 5. It may in fact be best for black to take the knight anyway in this position, but I felt that I wanted to wait for white to waste a tempo by playing pawn to rook 3. This turned out to be a mistaken idea. I played 11 queen's knight to queen 2, and white played 12 knight to queen's 2. This is why it would have been better for black to take last move. White manages to avoid the exchange of bishop for knight completely here, which is definitely to white's advantage. Black has to take 12 bishop takes bishop, 13 queen takes bishop for white, rook to king's 1 for black. Notice that the white queen is just as effective as the bishop in preventing black from moving his queenside pawns. White's centre is also solid in this position, so he judges the time is right to begin his own attack on the king side. He played 14 pawn to bishop's 4. I replied with queen to bishop 2, unpinning the knight on king's bishop 3. Now white played 15 queen to bishop 3. The queen is very well placed here for subsequent play down the king's bishop's file. I played 15 pawn to bishop 5. About time black got moving on the queen side, and moreover black threatens to play pawn to queen's knight 4 here. This is possible because black will have a check with his queen on the long black diagonal. White answered with the powerful 16 king to rook 1, preventing black's pawn to queen's knight 4. I played 16 queen's rook to knight 1. Although this doesn't turn out very well, and it might have been better to put the rook on bishop's 1 instead, and admit that black is already on the defensive. White played 17 queen's rook to king's 1, the last preparation white needs for his central advance. Black went 17 pawn to knight 4, 18 pawn takes pawn for white, pawn takes pawn for black. It might seem that black is okay in this position. He's threatening to drive away the white knight by pawn to knight 5. Unfortunately, white is now fully prepared for his action in the centre, and it is white who strikes the first blow, with 19 pawn to king's 5. Pawn takes pawn for black, 20 pawn to bishop 5. A nasty position for black. We saw this pawn sacrifice in the game Penrose v Towel. It is entirely typical of the modern Benoni. With this pawn sacrifice, white converts his queen's pawn into a passed pawn, and gains the square king's 4 for his knights. Simultaneously, black's own pieces are reduced in scope. His bishop on king's knight 2 cannot develop any activity, whilst the blockading pawn remains on king's 4. Indeed, in this position, virtually all black's pieces seem to be directed at this useless blockader, and it severely cramps their activity. I in fact played 20 rook to king's bishop 1 at this point, defending the knight on king bishop 3 after a pawn exchange. In fact, I might have done better to play the rather desperate move pawn to king 5, which at least gets the square king's 4 for a knight, although white would remain with a massive superiority. White played his knight on queen 2 to king's 4. The pressure is mounting on black's king's bishop 3, so I played rook to knight 3. White played 22 rook to queen's 1. This move emphasizes just how bad the black position is. The threat is to play pawn to queen 6, cutting off black's defense along the third rank. Then the knight on king's bishop 3 will become very weak, and white could exchange twice on this square, leaving black with a bishop, and then play knight to queen's 5, which would be a terrible fork. Altogether a completely dismal position for black. He has no possible active play at all. For the rest of this game, see the accompanying booklet. We can see here the strength of the typical Benoni ploy for white of playing pawn to king's 5, pawn takes pawn, pawn to bishop 5. This can often be very dangerous, as white gets not only immediate attacking chances, but a large long-term positional advantage, based on his blockade of the black pawn on king's 4. Let's go back to position 3 now. The line I would like to recommend for black in this position, to avoid such a fate, is 9 rook to king's 1, 10 knight to queen's 2 for white, queen's knight to queen 2 for black. This variation is of a different character to the lines we have looked at so far. Instead of concentrating entirely on queenside play, which as we have seen leaves white with a free hand for his push in the centre, black intends to play actively himself in the centre and even on the king side. His knights can often infiltrate into weak spots into the white position. A dramatic example of this is the game Farrago v Szilágyi, Hungary 1974. In this game, white played 11 pawn to queen's rook 4. This is the most popular move for white in the position, White leaves his queen on queen's 1, plays a good solid move, and awaits developments. Black replied 11 knight to king's 4. It's not so easy for white to displace this knight. If he plays pawn to king's bishop 4 directly, the knight will simply come in on black's king's knight 5, and there'll be some dangerous threats around there. In fact, if white wishes to drive the knight off, he has first of all to prepare with pawn to king's rook 3, and this is a rather slow plan. So white played 12 queen to bishop 2 here. He's still hoping to get rid of that intruding black knight on king's 4, but black found a move here which completely crossed white's plan to dislodge this piece. Switch off now and see if you can think what this move might be. The move played was 12 pawn to king's knight 4. A very unusual move to see in the Benoni. It weakens black's king's bishop's 4 and exposes it to infiltration by a white knight, for example knight to queen's 1 to king 3 to king bishop 5. But this weakness isn't so serious so long as black maintains his white squared bishop. Then he can capture the knight when it arrives. The point of this is to maintain the knight on king's 4, and the further advance of the king's knight's pawn can often lead to a dangerous kingside attack for black. White played 13 knight to queen's 1. A very sensible move. It prepares to come up to king's 3 to probe black's weak spots, and also there's a possibility of switching the queen's rook into play via queen's rook 3, stopping black's attack and perhaps exploiting the weakening of black's kingside created by the advance of his king's knight's pawn. Black responded with 13 pawn to knight 5. This cuts off the white's bishop's guard of black's king's rook 4 and prepares the manoeuvre knight to king's rook 4 to king bishop 5, furthering black's attacking chances. White played 14 knight to king 3, and black went knight to rook 4. At this point, white committed an error. He should have avoided weakening his kingside so much as possible, and played a more flexible move at this point, such as rook to rook 3 for example. Instead, he played 15 pawn to king's knight 3. A natural move, keeping the black knight out of king's bishop's 5 in the most direct possible way. But unfortunately, the weakness of the white kingside proves disastrous in the long run. Black played 15 queen to bishop 3. Black now has all his pieces, apart from his queen's rook, actively placed in relation to white's kingside, and the weakness of white's king's bishop 3 square is particularly noticeable here. White attempted to remedy this weakness by playing 16 pawn to bishop 4 at this point. Seemingly a good move, as it liquidates the cramping effect of the black king's knight's pawn, and also enables white to bring his queen's knight over to the king's side. The defect is that it also allows the black queen's bishop to enter the attack with gain of tempo. Black played 16 pawn takes pawn EP. White recaptured 17 knight takes pawn, and black went bishop to rook 6. We can see that there are no dangerous discovered attacks by the white knight on king's bishop 3. Any move of this piece is simply answered by bishop takes rook for black. So white played 18 rook to bishop 2, maintaining the rook on the half-open king's bishop's file, and preparing some threats against the black queen. So black played 18 knight takes knight check. White went 19 bishop takes knight. And now black defended the attacked knight on king's rook 4 by playing 19 queen to knight 3. The threat here is to play bishop to queen's 5 by black. There would be so many white pieces on the diagonal leading to his king, it would take him many moves to disentangle them all. While white obviously thought this threat was rather nasty, he played 20 knight to knight 2. This may seem surprising, because it does allow black to pin the white rook, but white thought he had a satisfactory response ready. Black went 20 bishop to queen 5, and white went 21 knight to rook 4. This is the point. He is willing to concede the exchange on king's bishops 2, because after white recaptures, black's queen will have no square which maintains the guard of the knight on king's rooks 4, so white thinks he is going to win 2 pieces for a rook. However, black continued surprisingly with a piece sacrifice, just giving up the knight on king's rooks 4 and not bothering to take the exchange on king's bishops 2. He played 21 queen to bishop 3. White grabbed the piece, 22 bishop takes knight, and black played 22 rook takes pawn. The threat is mate in 1. Moreover, the rook can't be taken, mate in 2. If white plays the natural move 23 bishop to bishop 4 here, black would reply 23 rook takes bishop, white pawn takes rook, black 24 queen takes knight. Black would still be the exchange down in this position, but there would be various dangerous attacks. White's king's bishop 2 is attacked, the bishop on king's rook 5 is attacked, and perhaps most dangerous of all, there's the threat of simply playing king to rook 1, followed by rook to king's knight 1 check with a mating attack. So let's replace the white knight on king's rooks 4, black queen on king's bishop 3, white bishop queen's bishop 1, white pawn on king's knight 3, and black rook on black's king's 5. So white played 23 knight to knight 2, an alternative method of covering the king's 1 square. Black replied with 23 queen's rook to king's 1, renewing the back rank threat. Now white did play 24 bishop to bishop 4, not only stopping the mate, but also interrupting the black queen's attack on white's king's bishop 2. Switch off now and see if you can discover how black proceeded with his attack. Black played 24 queen to bishop 4. Now, where does white put this bishop on king's rook 5? Can't go to king's knight 4. Can't go to king 2. Black would just take it off. Remember, the white rook on king's bishop 2 is pinned. And it can't go to queen's 1. That would allow black to mate on the back rank. So in fact, this bishop is in a very tricky position. White therefore continued with 25 pawn to king's knight 4. And now black has a knockout blow. He played 25 queen takes bishop on white's king's bishop 4. A complete disaster for white. If he takes the queen, then it's mate in 2. If he doesn't, he's sure to lose more material. A very nice attacking game from black, and notice how in this game there was no queenside play whatsoever for black. All black's play was in the centre and on the king side. This is the great difference of the rook to king's 1 and queen knight to queen 2 plan against the classical. black must be prepared to become active wherever the opportunity presents itself. Let's go back to position 3 now. This game we're about to see is Larsen v Lebojevic from Milan 1975. It's a top game between two of the world's leading players, and it really is most exciting. Black played 9 rook to kings 1, white 10 knight to queens 2. Black queens knight to queen 2. And once again white played the popular 11 pawn to queens rook 4. In the last game black played knight to kings 4 here, but here we see a different approach to the problems of this position. The defect with knight to kings 4 is that the knight can be driven off by playing pawn to kings rook 3 and pawn to kings bishops 4 by white, and if black wishes to maintain the knight, he has to play this very double-edged move pawn to kings knights 4. And although in the previous game it succeeded, I think most players would consider this a really very double-edged move to play, and if white had continued more accurately and not weakened his kingside, he could probably have got the advantage. So the move which was played in this game was 11 pawn to queens rook 3. White has various possibilities. He might, for example, play pawn to bishops 4 at this point, in which case black's strongest reply is queen to bishop 2, and there's quite a good chance that we will transpose back into the game. So put the black queen back on queens 1, and the white king's bishop's pawn on bishop 2. The remaining alternative for white is to play queen to bishop 2 here, and black's most accurate response is to play rook to knight 1. And play generally proceeds along the lines we shall see. Black will put his pieces, his queen on queen's bishop 2, and the queen's knight often jumps out to king's 4 or queen's knight 3 to challenge the white knight when it arrives on queen's bishops 4. So black rook back on queen's rooks 1, white queen back on queen's 1. Larsen tried a new move in this game. He played 12 king to rook 1. Black played rook to knight 1, and white went 13 pawn to bishops 4. Lebojevic's response to this move was extremely violent and drastic, but it's not really necessary to play in such an aggressive manner. Let's have a careful look at a line which isn't quite so sharp. This line is 13 queen to bishop 2 for black. White must play a constructive move here, and he wants to move the knight on queens 2, which at the moment is tied to the defence of the king's pawn. So his best move is probably queen to bishop 2. Notice that if white ever decides to support his king's pawn by bishop to bishop 3, for example, black will be able to play pawn to queen's knight 4 in reply. Well, what does black do after 14 queen to bishop 2? The strongest move here is pawn to bishop 5. Switch off here and analyse the consequences of the white captures on queen's bishops 4. If white plays 15 knight takes pawn, black plays pawn to queen's knights 4. Now, the threat is that if the white knight moves, pawn to knight 5 will attack a pinned knight. It's pinned against the white queen. So white has to move at this point so as to defend the queen on queen's bishop 2. So he plays knight to king's 3. Black plays pawn to knight 5, all the same. White, for example, plays the knight on queen bishop 3 back to queen's 1. Black plays queen takes queen. White plays knight takes queen. And black captures the white king's pawn, knight takes pawn. This position is favourable for black. He has a lead in development, and his pieces are far more active than white's, which have been driven right back to the first 2 ranks. Moreover, there is a certain amount of danger involved in the weak white queen's pawn and in the loose bishop on white's king's 2. Black would have excellent chances in this endgame. Well, now we place the black knight on king's bishop 3, the white pawn on king's 4, the black queen on queen's bishop 2, the black queen's knight's pawn should be pushed back to knight 2, the white knight to queen bishop 3, other white knight to queen 2, white queen on queen bishop 2, and black pawn on black's queen's bishop 5. So the main line for white here is the capture with the bishop. 15, bishop takes pawn. Black plays pawn to queen's knight 4. White plays 16, pawn takes pawn. Black plays pawn takes pawn. White can't take on queen's knight 5, because after black's recapture with the rook, his queen is undefended, and white will just have lost a piece. Again, white has the problem that if he moves the bishop, the black pawn move to knight 5 will attack a pinned knight. So the bishop must move so as to defend the queen here. 17, bishop to queen 3. Black plays pawn to knight 5. If white plays 18, knight to king's 2 here, black plays 18, queen takes queen. White plays 19, bishop takes queen. And black plays 19, knight takes queen's pawn, exploiting the fact that the white knight on king 2 is undefended. Here we have another ending in which black has excellent chances. His knight is already threatening to leap in at king 6 with a fork, and the remaining black pieces, particularly that bishop on king's knight 2, are becoming extraordinarily active. Put the black knight back on king bishop 3, white pawn on queen 5, white bishop on queen 3, white queen on queen bishop 2, black queen on black's queen bishop 2, and the white knight on king 2 should be moved to queen's bishop 3. White does best here, therefore, to keep his knight off that dangerous king's file, and to play 18, knight to queen 1 instead. Black plays queen takes queen, and white plays bishop takes queen. Black plays 19, knight to bishop 4, threatening the white king's pawn. Notice it is impossible for white to defend this with his rook, as this would leave his queen's pawn undefended. So white must play 20, knight to bishop 2. Black plays pawn to knight 6, and white retreats his bishop to queen's knight 1. Finally, black plays 21, bishop to queen's rook 3, attacking the white rook on king bishop 1. As usual, it can't go to king's 1, and so white must play 22, rook to queen's 1 in this position. Well, switch off now and have a look at the position. See what you think, and whether or not black has sufficient compensation for this pawn he's given up. Well, I think that black has plenty of compensation for the pawn here. It's not a position which is easy to analyse, but white is very tangled up. He can hardly move a piece without losing his king's pawn. all his pieces are blocked in. This did occur in a master game, and black eventually won, so experience would suggest that white's position is most uncomfortable. I think that not many players would enjoy defending such a cramped and prospectless position as we see on the board at the moment. Let's go back to position 4 now. So this line would be better if you don't go into the extraordinary complication that occurred in this game. In the game, Lebovic played 13 pawn to bishop 5. A remarkable move. We can readily understand that if white plays 14 knight takes pawn, black plays knight takes king's pawn, white plays 15 knight takes knight, black plays rook takes knight, white plays knight takes pawn, black plays rook to queen's 5. This regains the pawn, the white queen's pawn, and in the resulting open position, black will have quite good chances. His pieces are very active, they're all developed, whereas white needs at least 2 more moves to bring his pieces into the game. Notice that white can't play queen to knight 3 here. Black would reply knight to bishop 4, with a discovery on the white knight on white's queen 6. Let's go back to position 4 now, and add the move pawn to bishop's 5 by black. The other possibility for white here is to capture the queen's bishop's pawn with his bishop. Black would then play 14 knight to bishop 4. Should white play his queen to the queen's bishop's 2 here, then black could play knight to king's knight 5, and there would be dangerous threats occurring already on king 6. White would be in rather a tangle and find it rather hard to deal with the various threats coming from black's active pieces. So put the white queen back on queen's 1 and the black knight on king's bishop 3. A better move for white, therefore, is to play 15 queen to bishop 3, covering not only the white king's pawn, but also the slightly weak squares on white's king's bishops 2 and king's 3. Black's strongest reply is 15 bishop to knight 5. White plays 16 queen to knight 3, and black lashes out with pawn to queen's knight 4. A very complex position indeed. Let's have a look at one typical line. 17 pawn takes pawn for white, pawn takes pawn for black, 18 bishop takes pawn for white, black takes the king's pawn with his knight on queen's bishop 4, and white takes the knight with the knight on queen's 2. Black replies 19 knight takes knight, white plays 20 queen takes bishop. Black now plays 20 rook takes bishop. It is impossible for white to capture the rook because of the reply knight to bishop 7 check, either winning the white queen or mating white on the back rank. So white has to be content here with playing 21 knight takes knight. Black plays rook takes knight. In this position, black is a pawn down, but the white pawns on queen's knights 2 and queen's 5 are both attacked, so that black will regain his pawn. For example, 22 queen to bishop 3, and black moves the attacked rook to queen's knight 5. This threatens the white queen's knight's pawn 3 times, so white loses that, and then the resulting position with equal pawns should be a draw. Let's go back to position 4 after this rather complicated variation. Add the move pawn to bishop 5 for black. Larsen tried a different continuation. He played 14 pawn to king's 5. Black played pawn takes pawn, and white played 15 knight takes pawn. Quite a sensible line for white. He gains a passed queen's pawn without any loss of material. Black must play actively here, or else the passed white's queen's pawn and the active white knights will be a decisive influence. Black played 15 pawn to queen's knight 4. White took this queen's knight's pawn, and black recaptured with the pawn. At this point, Larsen went wrong. He should have played the natural move knight to queen 6. Black's best reply is 17 pawn to knight 5. White takes the rook, knight takes rook, black plays queen takes knight, and white plays 19 knight to knight 5. White has won the exchange. Black has some tactical counterplay. He might play knight to king's 5 in this position, for example, but I think this offer is not really sound. So Lebojevich's idea, although extraordinarily imaginative, is not completely correct. But that doesn't detract from the merit of what is a magnificent game. We'll go back now to position 5. Larsen played 17 knight takes king's pawn, and black replied with pawn to knight 5. White at this point could have won the black queen by playing 18 knight to bishop 6. Black plays pawn takes knight. White plays knight takes queen. Black plays pawn takes pawn. White must take this pawn, bishop takes pawn, and black plays rook takes bishop. Two white pieces are under fire here, the bishop and the knight, so white must lose one of them, and black obtains 3 minor pieces for the queen. The position would then be very difficult for both sides, as in a middle game position the minor pieces often have the better of it. A difficult choice for Larsen, obviously, and he chose the other continuation. So let's go back to position 5 now, and add the moves 17 knight takes king's pawn for white, pawn to knight 5 for black. Larsen chose the alternative 18 knight to knight 5 here. Lebojevich replied knight takes knight, 19 pawn takes knight for white, rook takes pawn for black. White must continue aggressively because his queen's 5's pawn is under fire. He played 20 bishop to king's bishop 4. Now it would be unwise for black to play rook takes pawn. White would simply reply bishop takes rook, obtaining 2 rooks for the queen. So black instead took the white queen's pawn with his knight. 20 knight takes pawn. Larsen decided not to take the exchange immediately, but instead played 21 bishop to bishop 4, attacking the pinned black knight on queen's 4. Lebojevich defended it with bishop to king 3, and now Larsen took the exchange. 22 bishop takes rook. Bishop takes bishop by black. This position is slightly better for black. His 2 bishops are extremely active and can combine to attack the white king side. White played 23 queen to king's 2, black replied queen to knight 4, with the threat of knight to bishop's 5. So white played bishop takes knight, eliminating this piece. Black played bishop takes bishop. White played rook to rook 5, with dangerous discovery threats against all the black pieces on his fourth rank. So black played 25, rook to queen's bishop 1, and white went knight to rook 7. Now black's rook and both his bishops are endangered. Switch off and see if you can find how black finished off the game. He played 26, queen to rook 5, threatening mate in 1. The white king's knight's pawn is pinned, so the only defence is 27, queen takes bishop. And the point of the combination was revealed, 27, queen to bishop 7, threatening 3 different mates in 1. White has no move here. For example, 28, rook to king's knight 1, queen takes pawn check, and mates in 2 more moves. So white resigned. A very nice game indeed, demonstrating all the tactical possibilities for black in the Benoni. Well, that's the end of this cassette. I've played the opening about 40 times, and I found it leads to extremely interesting and tactical encounters. I've only lost to 2 players with it, Hort and Timon, and I think that's a pretty good record for any opening. I hope you have similar luck with it.